Hello, my name's Matthew Carmona. I'm a professor at the Bartlett at UCL. And today I want to talk to you about sustainable urban design. Now, in my book, Public Places, Urban Spaces, urban design is defined as the process of shaping better places for people than would otherwise be produced. This process, with all of its complex and overlapping dimensions, is represented in the centre of a diagram that features in the recent third edition of the book. And around its edge, the diagram also reflects the fact that urban design, wherever we practice it, is influenced by three critical contexts. First, how power is wielded and the balance between market and state. Second, the nature of the local context as defined by place and culture, and how that dictates both what we see and, of course, how we use the environment around us. And then third, the global context of sustainability and, of course, technology, and how patterns of development locally ultimately impact globally. And it's this final context that I'm going to focus on today, and in particular, what we mean by sustainable urban design. Now, while quite a few of the examples that I'll use to illustrate this talk are drawn from London and from the UK, where I live and work, I would suggest that the principles that I'm discussing today pretty much apply wherever you live. In the book, they inform and infuse the 8 dimensions of urban design that are the core of the book and the centre of the diagram. And of course, there is much more detail as well. But let's start today with the local. Now, ultimately, however we deal with the local, the aim should be to optimize its quality and potential, and to reduce its impact on the larger environment. In other words, the impact of the inner spheres on the outer spheres in this image, and ultimately on the global sphere. Arguably, this interrelationship of spatial scales is nothing new, as the relationships between town and country in Ebenezer Howard's famous 3 magnets diagram suggest. And they, in turn, echo the triple bottom line of sustainability, namely environment, economy, and society. Although one would have to say that still the environment consistently comes last in many of our development decisions, as local modes of development remain unsustainable pretty much wherever we live around the globe. Now, faced with such issues, the temptation may be to blame urbanization. The economist Edward Glaeser, in his book Triumph of the City, quotes Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "The true India is to be found not in its few cities, but in its 700,000 villages." Glaeser goes on to say, the great man got it wrong, as today India depends almost entirely on its cities for its development, reflecting the near perfect correlation between urbanization and prosperity across nations, and the very strong correlation between life satisfaction and the share of population living in urban areas. Although sometimes that might be hard to believe when faced with the sort of grinding poverty of some city dwellers, such as seen here in the slums of New Delhi. The answer to sustainability means ultimately, however, to be found in our cities. They represent just 2% of the Earth's surface, but house 50% of the human population, using 80% of the resources. And urban design has a vital part to play in how cities are shaped, and therefore in finding solutions to these challenges. Now, looking across the burgeoning literature on the subject, it's possible to identify some common key sustainable urban design considerations. And there are 9 of these that I'm going to focus on in this talk. Starting with the question of resource efficiency. And perhaps this is the most obvious of the principles, the need for greater resource efficiency. So if we take the UK, for example, then currently energy use in the UK splits between industry that uses about 15% of energy, different various services also use about 15%. The domestic sphere, where people live, their home environment, uses about 30%, and transport uses about 40%. So how we design cities has a huge impact on energy consumption, on transport, and particularly on that domestic sphere. In the UK, renewables account for approaching 45% of the electricity component of energy production. And that's energy production, not total energy, with a target to move in the UK to 100% by 2035. Other countries have similar targets, and one might argue that they don't go nearly far enough. To get to them, switching to renewable sources of energy will be key, both passive and active. And therefore, one might say it's a bit of a no-brainer. And these include well-established and deliverable technologies such as solar, wind, and geothermal technologies. These sorts of technologies are very well understood, and as I say, are very deliverable, although switching to them is likely to be expensive in the short run, and of course has aesthetic consequences as well. Poundbury, for example, a well-known development in the UK, one of Prince Charles's developments, pet developments, in this case on the edge of Dorchester, has very high environmental credentials, but doesn't allow roof-based solar panels simply for aesthetic reasons, which one might argue is perhaps a little bit short-sighted. The London Plan argues that 78% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions come from London's homes and workplaces, and it envisages a zero carbon city by 2030, much to be achieved through on-site carbon reduction, through these sorts of technologies that I've been talking about. But energy isn't the only sort of resource that we use. In much of the southeast of England, for example, climate change projections envisage a not very distant future in which we will face severe water stress, and that pressure and that those pressures on water are creeping to other parts of the UK as well, to the west and to the north. And the UK is certainly not alone in this regard. Many countries are facing a future where we will be increasingly under water stress. Too often, however, the discussion of sustainable urban design sort of stops at this point, following consideration of energy and some other resources such as water. There's a sense that there is perhaps a bit of a technological tyranny, but the answers to unsustainable living are seen simply as engineering problems to be addressed by new technology. For example, in the image here, you see a so-called sustainable supermarket that was designed and developed some time ago in Greenwich in southeast London, where I live. You can see it has its wind turbines out the front. It's partly an earth-buried structure. It uses natural light. But when they were developing it, nobody thought, or perhaps it wasn't really discussed, that 99% of its customers would come by car. So not really sustainable in any real sense. And I'll come back to this example a little bit later on in the talk. Perhaps too often we're seduced by new technologies. One such technology is driverless cars that people have talked about as being the answer to issues of congestion with potential energy efficiency benefits. But Yangel argues that driverless cars are a technology that he says are smart for the industry because they can sell lots of new gimmicks, lots of new cars, but which as a mode of mobility are utterly outmoded and essentially unsustainable. This is not to say that new technology is itself unsustainable. We need to embrace technology and what it can offer us, not least to understand the city and to understand the impacts of human beings on things like the flow of resources through urban areas. Using that knowledge in turn to better shape cities in the future and to enhance people's experience of using them will be key, not least through harnessing the sort of mini computer that we all carry around in our pockets. Moving on, not only do we need to think about inputs, but also outputs in terms of waste from the urban system. Ian McHarg long ago argued that we should see cities as functioning ecosystems, distorted but nevertheless real. Unfortunately, we have not been very good at that. For example, many of London's high streets, its main shopping streets, have concentrations of nitrogen oxide and particulates well above EU air quality objective levels, and in the past frequently 2 and sometimes 3 times safe levels. The Greater London Authority commissioned research in 2015 that suggested that pollution at that time contributed to over 9,000 premature deaths in London annually from a combination of long-term exposure to nitrogen dioxide and particulates. Although London's new low emissions and now its ultra low emission zones are rapidly improving the situation. In fact, the ultra low emission zone, as I talk now, is just being expanded to cover the whole of the city, the whole of the Greater London area. And of course, many cities globally are in a much worse situation than London, and sometimes in truly desperate positions as regards pollution, with problems extending to how we deal with rubbish, water, sewerage, fuel, food, construction materials, as well as air pollution, and so on and so forth. Despite what Yangel suggests, changing technologies, for example, electric cars, can help us deal with some of these sorts of challenges in more or less intelligent ways, but are still only, and I think this is Yangel's point, still only partial solutions. For example, electric cars can't deal with congestion, they can't deal with particulates from cars, or the carbon from electricity production, and the energy demands of the heavier battery-driven cars that we're increasingly producing, all of which remain major issues going forward. The aspiration should be to move from linear forms of urban metabolism to circular ones, where both inputs and outputs are reduced and more resources remain within the city. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation suggests that this circular economy should be based on three principles, all heavily influenced ultimately by how we design places. So eliminating waste and pollution, circulating products and materials, and regenerating nature. What can be simplified to the three R's of reduce, reuse, and recycle? On the screen here is a picture that my daughter recently brought home from her primary school. And it shows that the newer generations, the younger generations, really get this stuff. They're learning about it early, but it's something that older generations like my own really still need to properly understand and engage with. The aspiration, of course, is that if we routinely adopt the classic three R's, a fourth R, removal of waste, should only be necessary as a last resort. But we're not there yet. And perhaps because of that, or maybe just a love of alliteration, others are adding on more R's. David Cheshire in the book Building Revolutions gives us 7 R's, significantly adding refurbish and retrofit, which relates back to the idea of regenerating, including regenerating nature, such as the installation of pollinator street lamps across Liverpool here in the UK, for example. Amsterdam go even further. They actually define 10 R's, but I think you get the point. Fundamentally, this is about moving to a different mindset across different urban scales, ultimately leading to a circular city. A critical dimension of waste is that caused by the demolition of existing buildings. So let alone the rebuilding costs, it can take 40 years of energy efficiency measures to compensate for the embodied energy used in new build development. 15 years after it was built, the sustainable supermarket in Greenwich was demolished, in this case to make way for an IKEA store. Here today, gone tomorrow. The only thing that remains is the car park. None of this is sustainable and certainly not resilient in any sense. We need instead to take pride in buildings, the buildings that we build today, and build them to last. The old Royal Naval College in Greenwich, just a mile or so down the road from the site of that former sustainable supermarket, is a great case in point. Now, these buildings on the screen there were built in 1712, originally as a rather grand hospital and retirement home for injured merchant seamen. In 1873, they were taken over and the Royal Navy converted them into a college for training Royal Navy mariners, including, at one time, it even had its own little nuclear reactor for training submariners. In 1999, the Navy no longer needed it, and Greenwich University took it over along with the Trinity School of Music, and they're still there today. But it's also used as a public venue, as a place for tourists, but also it has its own comedy festival, all sorts of arts events and public celebrations are held there. It's even used sometimes for a film venue. But of course, reuse doesn't have to be quite so grand as the old Royal Naval College. The conversion of former warehouses to residential or business uses, such as the conversion and dramatic expansion of the Tropical Fruit Warehouse in Dublin, are now pretty widespread, as increasingly have been the conversion of surplus offices and shops to residential, sometimes successfully and sometimes less so. Infrastructure should also be resilient and can sometimes be adapted for new uses when no longer viable in its original use. Promenade Plantée in Paris is the forerunner to the High Line in New York. It provides a great case in point of the reuse of a former railway to create a new linear park running through Paris. In London, Tate Modern is a former power station that is now used as an amazing art gallery. Repurposing infrastructure when we no longer need it for its original purpose. Now, retaining and mixing the old with the new is part of the fourth consideration, diversity and choice, just as Jane Jacobs advised us 65 years ago. This is essentially an argument for a rich mix over sterile monoculture in all its guises. So we're talking here about mixing uses, mixing activities, mixing people, and mixing spaces of different types and buildings of different ages and times. Criticism of sterile monoculture goes back to the early critiques of zoning by Jane Jacobs and others, and finds its latest incarnation in the 15-minute city. Now, contrary to crazy conspiracy theories that 15-minute cities are somehow attempts to forcefully stop people moving around cities by trapping them in their home neighborhoods as a form of control, 15-minute cities are in fact nothing new and are simply about ensuring that people have everything they need within easy access. In this case, a short 15-minute walk or bike ride, including access to jobs and schools and food and parks, community and medical facilities, and so forth. The aim is to create more sustainable, more equitable and healthier cities, opening up rather than restricting choice, in this case, the choice to live locally. Now, during the pandemic, when we were all forced to be at home much more and became very aware of the strengths or shortcomings of our home neighbourhoods, these ideas gained significant renewed traction. But as I say, really go back to the early origins of urban design as a subject and the desire to live in perhaps a more diverse and mixed type of environment. Following the pandemic, many cities have taken the opportunities to introduce low traffic neighbourhoods, typically on the grounds of health, on health grounds. But of course, allowing choice for some things, in this case, the choice to walk and cycle, or for children to play out in the street, inevitably means restricting other choices, in this case, the choice for people to drive through such a neighbourhood. And that can be controversial. Ultimately, urban areas should be endlessly varied and stimulating. And post-pandemic, it's these qualities that will ensure their future, including the future of sustainable, vibrant urban centres. Underpinning mix is the need for a concentration of people in places. But this is one of the most contentious of sustainable objectives here in Britain and in much of the Western world. If we look at London and Hong Kong, for example, they both have similar populations, about 8 million, but distribute their people very differently. The built-up area of Hong Kong could fit into London's parks. And this makes Hong Kong a very energy efficient city. But it also has significant livability implications. And higher density is seen often very negatively in the West. contributing to the dominant sprawl model that we've tended to see, with cities spreading out rather than building more intensely. Yet even in the West, our impact from person to person varies hugely. Edward Glacier points out that if the environmental footprint of the average suburban home is a size 15 hiking boot, the environmental footprint of a New York apartment is a size 6 Jimmy Choo. Greater concentration of urban areas is key, as beyond a doubt it leads to less energy usage per head of population. But density is often misunderstood. It doesn't have to mean living like this. This is a very large housing estate in South London, which people, certainly in this country, in the UK, often associate with dense living in this sort of environment. It also doesn't have to mean building high. Skyscrapers are, in fact, at least a third more energy hungry over the course of their lifespans than any other form of development. It could mean this. Now this, in fact, is Chelsea in West London. The architect Terry Farrell has pointed out that the highest density and the highest house prices in London are in the same place, the borough of Kensington and Chelsea, along with, in fact, some of the largest areas of open green space in London, such as Kensington Gardens, and some of the loveliest green spaces, some of London's Georgian green squares. Now, a key dimension of what makes places such as Kensington and Chelsea so desirable are their distinctive historic streets, spaces, and architecture. In London, the proposed redevelopment of Covent Garden in the 1970s and the public outcry that followed changed attitudes to the vital importance of the historic built environment. Today, Covent Garden represents a valuable piece of London, economically, socially, and culturally, all generated out of its unique sense of place. But the pace of change has quickened, and many pressures today act to homogenise both the natural and the built environment. Much contemporary development is characterised by a sort of blatant disregard for place and context, replaced instead by a primary concern for the individual piece of real estate or infrastructure. We consistently break what Francis Tibbles described as the golden rule, that places matter before buildings, or places matter most. Often there is little regard for history, despite the great scope to learn from the past. Venice in Doha in Qatar, complete with its own Ponte Rialto and advisory Instagram locations, but no people, provides a dramatic example of such a disregard for history. It provides also a greatly sanitized version, of course, of the real thing. And too often we're focused, it seems, on making a quick buck and ignore the damage that we are doing to place, often to historic places, such as here, the City of London. George Bernard Shaw said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in adapting or trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore," he said, "progress depends on the unreasonable man." But we're born into a society and an environment fashioned long before our time. So we should start by carefully understanding what we see around us, how our conditions have emerged, how they are relevant to the needs of society today, and how they could be changed for the better through a bit of that unreasonableness and wanting to see change and wanting to see innovation. We need that, but we also need to understand our existing conditions and what can be valued and what we want to retain in the future. Both physically, what is special physically about places, but also socially, what is special socially, and however that imprints itself on the quality of place. And of course, a key challenge today is to create distinctive contemporary places that will stand the test of time, places that we will be valuing into the future. A great example is distinctive layout, architecture, public spaces, and landscape. Landscape, of course, plays a key role in supporting the biotic environment. Ken Yang described 4 interconnecting infrastructure armatures as the critical dimensions of eco-master planning. These were grey, or infrastructure, the infrastructure armature, the red, or human armature, green, or biotic, and the blue, or hydrological armature. Each, he argued, needs to be understood and manipulated through the act of design, but typically, he said, we tend to neglect the blue and the green through our focus on the red and the grey. The impacts are, of course, multiple, but one is that the build-up of hard surfaces in cities on buildings and streets is creating urban heat island effects. So the accumulation of heat is further increased by traffic pollution and the heat released from waste, and also the impact of climate change, which means that in many of our urban areas, these effects are becoming worse. In London, the difference between the suburbs and the centre can be as much as 6 degrees. Internationally, urban heat islands are often associated with poverty and can have dramatic health impacts on the least advantaged in society in particular. The potential of greening to reduce such effects is well known, but we need to think more carefully about how we can integrate the green and the natural with the built and the human. It doesn't necessarily have to mean having goats living on our roofs, for example. Landscape should no longer be seen just as an afterthought. We should recognise its critical biotic as well as its critical aesthetic function in our cities. It's also about avoiding what Jane Jacobs described as indeterminate land oozes, where green infrastructure has really no ecological value and very little, perhaps even negative social value, such as the example here. Thus, within urban and suburban contexts, the natural environment can deliver recreational opportunities for sport, place-based relaxation, wildlife habitats, places for capturing and recycling water, venues for events, spaces for the city to breathe and to help it cool down, all with huge health and livability benefits for us all. Particularly if we can string together those individual pieces of green infrastructure in order to maximise their value for recreational amenity and wildlife. I live in southeast London, as I've said, quite a dense urban area, but also I live close to part of the East London green grid, which once you are in it allows you to walk for miles through a network of green spaces. And this is something that policy over many years now has attempted to develop and extend, tying different pieces of green infrastructure together. The biotic environment also contributes decisively to a further goal, that of greater self-sufficiency. And this can be on a large scale but might also be on a very small and local scale in urban areas, through things like generating more of our resources locally, energy, water, as I've said, capturing water, but also generating food locally as well. For example, in some of these images, you can see chickens living on a rooftop in Dalston in North London, a very, very dense part of the city, or fruit and veg production in King's Cross, or vines, in this case, being grown in a car park in the middle of Nicosia. Rocky Park in Bethnal Green in East London offers an excellent example of converting an unloved swath of green grass into a much loved shared garden space, generating produce for the local community. Roger Stirk Harbour and Partners' Sky Farm goes much further, imagining vertical farms in urban areas. Is this a technological tyranny? I'm not sure, but it's certainly great to imagine that the future might include such things. Finally, we need to recognise that none of what I've talked about so far will be possible without meeting human needs in terms of the basic well-being of population. We need to bring people along with us in order to get buy-in to sustainable principles. And that means shaping places that meet all the other objectives of great urban design, those things covered by the dimensions at the centre of the diagram that I began this talk with, and the subject of a whole series of other lectures in their own right. They include designing for things like equality, opportunity, human scale, legibility, visual richness, safety and security, health, accessibility, comfort, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, space is precious, and we have choices in how we use it. We can, for example, choose to fill our spaces, our streets, like this, which represents, in fact, relatively few people, that you might group together to travel through the city in a different way, on a bus, for example, which takes much less space, freeing up the public realm for entirely different uses and entirely different, more sustainable modes of movement and getting around and social activities and engagement. And of course, we have choices in relation to all the sustainable urban design principles that I've talked about, albeit that transformation of urban areas from unsustainable to a sustainable mode of urbanism is unlikely to be quick or easy. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. The journey towards sustainable urbanism will be one of many small steps, all of which contributes to my core argument that good urban design is sustainable. This means a process of shaping better places for people than would otherwise be produced because the default is too often unsustainable. So because it creates a local urban environment better able to meet human needs in a less resource-intensive manner, good urban design should be our starting point. And of course, it should be where we end up as well. Thank you so much for listening to me. Goodbye.